Welcome everyone to tonight's Rappahannock Valley Civil War Roundtable. To all our members, our guests, both in-state, in the state of Virginia, and out of state tonight. Tonight we have a special guest from the National Park Service, Superintendent Brandon Bies. And Brandon is the superintendent of the Manassas National Battlefield Park, but I understand now that he's on a temporary assignment to the Deputy Chief of Staff for the National Park Service. So clearly you've got a lot on your agenda right now, and I'm glad you're able to take some time and be with us tonight. He has also served as the legislative coordinator for the National Capital Region of the Park Service, the site manager of Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial up near Arlington Cemetery. And he started at Manassas National Battlefield as an archaeologist, and has also spent some time as a cultural resources specialist at George Washington Memorial Parkway and is site manager at Great Falls Park. So he's been around a bit, and he holds a bachelor degree in American history and anthropology and a master's degree in applied anthropology. And tonight he's going to talk to us about an unprecedented discovery at his battlefield, which you may have heard about, but tonight we're going to hear a lot more about it. Brandon, take it away. Brandon Bies.
All right, super. Thanks for the introduction. Thrilled to talk about the Civil War for a bit. As you mentioned, I've been detailed to the Park Service headquarters as Park Service Deputy Chief of Staff since COVID started. So I've actually not physically been at Manassas, though I should be back to the park in another month or so. So I haven't gotten to talk about Civil War lately. So I welcome the opportunity to do it this evening and talk about what really has been one of the most exciting discoveries of my Park Service career. Again, as my background as a military archaeologist, this is indeed a fairly unprecedented discovery. So if you bear with me for a second, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so again, tonight we're going to be talking about what was really an absolutely unprecedented discovery that the Park Service made a few years back. And I'm going to talk about not only that discovery, but the incredible science that has been done to learn more about these individuals whose lives were lost or forever changed on the Manassas battlefield, and to talk a little bit more about what that science has allowed us to find out about their lives, about where they were lost in the battlefield, and about medical science, that with the decisions that were made to save them, or in some cases by those Civil War surgeons to decide those who they could not save. So with that, I'm going to move on to a quick 2-minute video that we tested this out with Jeff. I think this should work for everyone. If you've got sound, obviously you got sound, you can hear me talking. You're going to see about a 2-minute video here, which is really just, it kind of gives a great summary of this project. You know, the Park Service, we like to build suspense. We're good storytellers. Well, in this case, I'm just going to give you guys this whole story in 2 minutes so you can meet some of the people involved, see some of the incredible forensic scientists who were involved in this, and then I'll go into great detail about how we figured this all out. So I'm going to give this a shot and show a 2-minute video. It's not. Let's see. Oh, God, yes. That's the front of the bullet. Yep. And then I got the skirt of the bullet back here.
This is a project that was so illuminating in terms of what it can tell us about events at Manassas Battlefield, the lives of these men, who they are, and also a story of the surgeons that tried to help them.
There's a lot of choices that those surgeons had to make when they realized that they were left and supplies were not coming in, and they basically had to fend for themselves along with thousands of wounded.
Because of the research that has been done, we can start to have a personal side, a personal connection to these soldiers and these remains. So instead of some bones, you're looking at somebody who was between 30 and 34 years old and was from the state of New York. That person may have had a wife, may have children, and it makes it a much more personal story for us and for us to share.
All right, so hopefully that sets the stage for what an incredible discovery this was. How the fascinating science, which is going to be a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, is really the science behind this discovery. But hopefully that video was also a somber reminder of what a serious subject this is, that we're talking about, again, as I said in the introduction, American soldiers who in some cases never made it home to their families, and their families never knew what happened to them. And so in terms of ground rules for this conversation, sometimes you'll see I'll get pretty excited about the science and what we've been able to figure out, but it's just always good and important for us to remember that lives were changed forever, and we treat these soldiers with the same reverence today as we would a modern day soldier who was killed or missing in action. And so, you're going to see pictures of skeletons and the remains of American service members here, and so don't take a screenshot and post it as your Facebook profile picture or something weird like that. Just realize that we're going to be looking at the remains of American service members, and we need to treat them appropriately. And the second is, before folks ask, ultimately, at this stage, I will not be able to reveal specifically on the battlefield where this discovery was made. And that is unfortunately because we still have very real concerns about resource protection and people who might not be well-intentioned, sneaking in and trying to find artifacts. As you will see and hear during this presentation, these remains were incredibly shallow. They were about 10 inches below the surface. And so until we have completed our work, we also have reason to believe that there may be more remains in the ground at this exact location. And so for the time being, we're not revealing the specific location on the battlefield where it is. So I'm going to jump into it. I'm going to try to talk here for about another 35 or 40 minutes and then leave room for questions at the end, because I'm sure there'll be some questions. So how did this get started? So in the National Park Service, we are very careful. All federal agencies are supposed to be careful when they're doing tasks that have ground disturbance, to make sure that they're not going to mess up an archaeological site, whether they know about that site or don't know about that site. The National Park Service, obviously, we take that especially seriously because of our mission in the Park Service and preserving resources. And of course, on battlefields, we take it super seriously because of the potential of things that could be beneath our feet. And so in 2014, the park decided that they needed to replace an existing utility line. This was an already disturbed, very narrow corridor, but it was already disturbed, but there were some issues with that line. And so the park needed to come in and redig and replace that utility line. And so we came in, we brought in some archaeologists from the National Park Service, and they did some archaeological testing. And they, when they did that testing, they found, some things here and there. They found some things, you'll see this in the next slide, some of what you would expect to find on a battlefield, some domestic artifacts, and also some artifacts from the Civil War. But nothing incredible. And so the archaeologists said, look, you can move forward with this project, but when you do, make sure you use the narrowest backhoe bucket as possible to do this excavation, to control this. 1 second. Am I right, Jeff? Do I need to admit people? Is this on my end since I'm in charge?
Nope, I got it.
You got it. Okay, great. Thank you. So they had to use the narrowest backhoe bucket. And you can see in this bottom picture, this is the actual trench as it went through. It started off a little wider, but then they used a 1 foot wide bucket. So that's all we're talking about here. It's as narrow as you could do. And they had an archaeologist there on site monitoring just in case something should pop up. There was an archaeologist there ready to deal with it. And so again, as I mentioned, from that initial excavations, as well as the archaeological monitoring that happened when they went in October of that year to actually put in the utility line, they found domestic stuff that you would expect from a site that was, kind of near, a domestic area where people had been living for a long time, and also obviously military artifacts from the Civil War occupation. But what they were most surprised of was when a backhoe scoop came and deposited in the back dirt pile, the same pile that you saw in that last image, what was clearly a number of very small pieces, fragments of bone. I'm talking pieces of bone the size of, the head of an eraser on a pencil. I mean, tiny, tiny pieces. And it sounds kind of crazy in hindsight now, but given the location where this was in the battlefield, the initial reaction at the time was that this was probably like from a farm animal, like, cow bone or pig bone or something like that. And it was highly broken up. But the archaeologist, of course, kind of temporarily stopped things, collected everything. But at this point, because of the way the backhoe was working, it was very difficult to figure out where along this trench exactly these bone fragments came from. So they collected the bone. They saw that where they were currently digging didn't have any more, so they kept moving with the utility line. Meanwhile, the archaeologist packaged up almost 200 pieces of, again, just like splinters, very small pieces of bone. And as we always do, took them back to our Park Service lab here for the Washington, D.C. area. And those archaeologists in the lab started to clean them off. And they looked at them and they said, these may not be from a domestic animal. These look, maybe we want to have somebody take a look at these. So we have had a 35 year partnership with the Smithsonian Institution, their physical anthropology, forensic anthropologists, Dr. Doug Owsley and his shop. For anyone who has studied this or read about this in the past, we are talking about the absolute leading forensic pathologists, archaeologists in the United States, if not in the entire world. These are the folks that crack open lead-sealed coffins for the first time in 400 years, and look at historic murder victims, and you name it, they have done it. So we are very fortunate to have a relationship with them. And so we took it to them, and again, they are amazing, and they were able to take these 200 tiny fragments and start to piece them together. And what you see in front of you is a piece of a human leg bone that is made up of about maybe 30 of those pieces. And so they were able, you can kind of see the cracks and everything there where it's been glued back together. So imagine being given a puzzle of tiny pieces of bone, and then of those 200 pieces, figure out that what you were looking at was actually 4 distinct human limbs, in this case, 3 leg bones and 1 arm bone. And what they were also able to determine in 2 of the 4 bones was they had very clear examples of cut marks. You can see in this example here very clearly, although it's degraded, this has been clearly severed and cut. And so they came back to us with this information, and that immediately led us to believe that we were dealing with the site of a Civil War field hospital. There was some research to suggest that this location in the battlefield had been used. We didn't have a lot of specific information, but potentially been used for this purpose. And so we thought what we were dealing with were the remains of what we would call a limb pit. We've all read about the Civil War. We've read these stories of the surgeons in the piles piled up to the window of the house or whatnot, or the pit full of arms and legs. And that's what it seemed like we were dealing with. And so the National Park Service decided within the next year to gather the funding and to go back and to explore this site. That is not, I want to make something very clear. In the National Park Service, we are not in the business of trying to excavate burials or even partial burials or limb pits or anything like that. Yeah, that's part of what makes these battlefields so hallowed, so significant, right? Is when we go to them, we know that beneath our feet very well could be the remains of the soldiers who fought and died there. That it is these battlefields, they in many ways are the Arlington National Cemetery of the Civil War, because so many soldiers from the Civil War never made it home. And so the last thing the National Park Service wants to do is to go necessarily looking for these and to go dig them up. However, in this specific case, we wanted to know for our own planning and resource protection purposes what we were dealing with. The last thing we wanted was to put in another utility line or decide to put in a parking lot sometime 50 years down the road and potentially impact this again. So the thinking was to bring some archaeologists and the scientists from the Smithsonian out to the site and to go down and figure out just what this was, dig just down to the top of it and then stop. Not to necessarily dig it up, but just to see what we were dealing with, and then maybe take some pictures, map it in, and be very quiet about it. And the Park Service would know this is here, and we're going to protect it. Well, so we got the funding together. We called a bunch of archaeologists in from both the Park Service and some contract archaeologists, and we had the funding, because archaeology is not free. We had the funding to do 5 days of excavation. And so, as I said before, we didn't know exactly where along this trench line these were. And so what always happens in archaeology, you never find what you're looking for when you start. And so it wasn't until really the fourth day out of 5 that we came down on what was clearly what we were looking for, and then some. And so on the 4th and into the 5th day, they first came down on, and if you can see the screen here at the bottom, I'm not sure if folks can see my cursor, but I'm going to use it anyhow. It looks like I see nodding, so yes. So they came down on this section right here. If you look here, this is the trench, this churned up area. This is where the backhoe bucket went. And you can see that it quite literally took off the feet. These are legs, obviously, here. It took off the feet of these individuals who were here. So I want to just pause for a second. If this backhoe trench had been, I lost my cursor for a second. If this backhoe trench had been right here, we would not be having this conversation right now. I would not be the subject of your Civil War Roundtable tonight, because that is how close this trench came to completely missing this and us having absolutely no idea that there was a surgeon's pit there from during the Civil War. I'm talking if this had moved 8 or 10 inches this direction, we would have never known. But it went through, it took off their feet, it took off a little bit more from over here that we'll get to in a moment. And so they were digging along this trench line and they came down right here. And the archaeologists thought, aha, we found it. We found a pile of legs, right here. There's 3 legs, right? Well, they started expanding the legs, and the legs turned into torsos, and it became very clear that we were not just dealing with a pit of amputated limbs, but we were dealing with complete burials of soldiers. And that was a game changer. That was not what we expected. And as I said, we are not in the business of digging up the graves of Civil War soldiers on battlefields if we can help it. And so you can see right off the bat from what was exposed here that this soldier right here, we refer to this as burial 1. This soldier clearly has this is significant trauma that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about here tonight. You can already see it in this image. If I move over to this side, again, this is similar, just for point of clarification. You see a little bit of a rock showing up right here next to this knee. Here's that same rock right there. You go up here, so you've got the beginnings of another soldier, the rest of his body still uncovered under the soil here. His torso is up here. Well, this is a pile of human feet that were all resting, feet and shins were resting on top of his left shoulder. So this is burial 2, and then a pile of limbs right there. So in some cases, you're looking at what right off the bat we knew were amputated limbs that were being tossed in on top of these soldiers. Which again, I've read a lot of books about the Civil War. I'm sure folks on here have read more than I have. I have never read of a case where they were commingling complete burials and amputated limbs, which told us right away whatever was going on here was not a good situation. This was far from ideal circumstances, whatever was happening here. And so the decision was made at this point. Again, this is literally like a day's worth of work, that we were going to stop excavating what we had done and cover what we had. And you can see in this image right here, we have two complete human skeletons, one here and one here. And everything you see over here is an arm and mostly legs. Mostly these are all legs over here. We decided to not, this is Dr. Doug Owsley from the Smithsonian sitting here. We decided not to excavate where he was. And because we clearly had gotten into more than we had expected. We did spend a good bit of time. I'm going to explain this right here. You notice the skull of one soldier. We dug for quite a while. And honestly, our initial thinking was that this soldier burial one may have been decapitated. We wanted to ensure that we had everything that was there. But what turns out what happened was these remains are so shallow. I know it looks deeper in this picture, but the tops of these bones are 10 inches below the grass. The parts of these soldiers' bodies were actually carried away by plows in the years after the Civil War. The plows disturbed them, and so this soldier's head was partially gone, and the entirety of the soldier's head was gone. But we knew it had once been there because in the dirt behind, we did find 5 of his teeth. So it was clearly there at some point and then carried away somewhere else in the proximity. And so we decided in consultation with the Smithsonian scientists that we would actually go forward with removing the remains. And there were a couple reasons there. The primary reason was because the soil conditions, and I should back up for a second. So as I mentioned, I'm a military archaeologist by training. I was not working at Manassas. This was 3 years before I became superintendent, or 2 years before I became superintendent. I was working doing congressional affairs. I was going to work wearing a suit and tie every day, meeting with people on the Hill. And I got a call that this was ongoing. And because of my background, I'm very fortunate. I was asked to come out and to help out with this. And so I'm coming to this presentation not only as the superintendent who helps lead the park, who's responsible for sharing this resource, preserving this resource, but also I was actually there doing a lot of these excavations. So a lot of what I'm giving you is my firsthand experience. And so we decided the soil conditions here were extremely poor, some of the worst conditions I have ever seen, which meant everything was highly deteriorated. The artifacts that came out were crumbling and the bone was in very poor shape. And so the Smithsonian scientists advised us, if we simply took pictures and threw dirt back on top of this, within a matter of maybe 5 years, since they'd been exposed to oxygen, these bones would literally disappear. They would crumble and go away. And so we had, in effect, almost caused their destruction by discovering them. And so the decision was made to remove what we'd exposed, but to leave anything else that might be there. So we took a lot of measurements in the field, lots of photo documentation, and then we removed the artifacts and we brought them back to the lab. And that's the next piece that I'm going to talk about. So as you can see from this image, we ended up with a lot of human bones. There were 2 complete soldiers, and there were ultimately 11 amputated limbs, 1 arm and 10 legs. We had a lot of questions. We didn't know, right? This is Manassas Battlefield, Bull Run Battlefield. There were 2 battles that took place there. Are these casualties from July of 1861 or from August of 1862? Are these Union soldiers or these Confederate soldiers? Right off the bat, the archaeology gave us some clues, but it wasn't until we did the forensic science that we could really nail down who these soldiers were, what battle, and what side. And so with that, I'm going to get a little bit more into the science here. So we're going to talk about Burial 1. Burial 1 was the soldier that, as I mentioned, his head was missing, carried away by the plow, the one off to the side. We know from the forensic analysis the Smithsonian was able to do that he was between 25 and 29 years old. He was likely from upstate New York or New England. Well, how the heck did we figure that out? Because these soldiers did not have identifying marks on their uniforms. We did find some buttons on the uniforms, but they were kind of the generic eagle buttons. How on earth did we figure out they were from upstate New York or New England? This is amazing stuff. I'm not going to pretend to be able to fully explain this because I'm not a chemist, but the Smithsonian can do something that is called chemical isotope analysis. And what they do is they take a very small piece of bone, very, very small. It's destructive, very small, and they pulverize it and they put it in like a mass spectrometer and they shoot lasers at it, do all kinds of things, and they can pull out the isotopes in the bone that were in the drinking water that this person was drinking as their bones were being developed and they were growing up as a child, as an adolescent, and as a teenager. And then they can compare that to known isotope maps of the entire world. And they were able to look at these two soldiers and all 11 amputated limbs and determine that every one of these soldiers that was represented grew up drinking water from the northeastern United States, specifically New York, upstate New York, and New England. So these were clearly Union soldiers. There's one exception, and there was one soldier who had some isotopes that leads us to believe that he may have been from Ireland, which again, not a surprise whatsoever that you could have an Irish immigrant with these soldiers. And so the isotope analysis really makes it clear we are dealing with a Union surgeons, a Union field hospital. The soldier was about 5'7". We know that from within about a half an inch or so from looking at their leg and arm bones. And we knew that he was a fairly muscular guy. You can actually look at how the bones attach and all the facets and wear marks and things. And you can tell if they're a scrawny person or somebody involved in lots of heavy labor. And this was not necessarily a heavy set person, but it was clearly a well-built individual, very healthy person. They were wearing no discernible clothing at all. Absolutely none, which really, I mean, no sign of even buttons from where their undergarments could have been. Now, those buttons could have been oyster shell or bone, and they may have deteriorated. But we did find evidence of a round eyelet or a grommet near their shoulder. So that's a chance that could have been for maybe like a gum blanket, a rubber blanket that was used to maybe wrap the soldier as they were laid in the ground, possibly. Perhaps the most significant piece of this we're going to spend some time talking about is that I mentioned that leg trauma. There was a British imported Enfield bullet embedded in his femur. Not near it, not on the ground, it was physically stuck in his bone. I cannot tell you how rare that is. But bullets during the Civil War and even modern day that doesn't happen. They destroy the bone, they pass through, they get stuck in the flesh. It was literally stuck in the bone. And I'm going to share some theories in a moment as to why we think that happened. And then finally, portions of the body were disturbed by the plowing. So we're going to talk about this injury. These are graphic images of bones of a Union soldier, probably from New York. This is how this soldier was shot. So this is a right femur. This is from the back. This bullet went in. I'm used to standing when I do this, so you can't see where I point. This soldier was shot in the butt. He was shot in the lower right side of his rear end. If you can kind of picture where the socket of your femur is, it's pretty high actually. So he was shot just a few inches below that. And this bullet came in sideways. Again, we can tell by looking at this bullet exactly what bullet this is. This is an English Enfield bullet, and that is very significant. There were virtually no regiments at the First Battle of Manassas that were equipped with British Enfields. These were weapons that were imported by both sides. It was the most common rifled musket eventually used by the Confederates. It was the second most common used by the Union. But there was one exception of a Union regiment that may have had some of these, a very small number, maybe at the First Battle of Bull Run. But by the Second Battle, these would have been extremely common. And so that is basically an open shut case that this wound was inflicted during the Second Battle of Manassas. This bullet has gone in sideways. So it was not going at something had made it start to spin or turn, which changed the angle and also slowed it down. And that being slowed down is one of the reasons why it got stuck in the leg. And secondarily, it hit some of the absolute densest bone in the human body. this exact spot, right where your leg goes into your hip joint, is about the densest bone you could find. If this had hit them in the middle of the arm, maybe in the lower leg, certainly in the main chest of the body, this would have passed through. But it actually got stuck. It caused a massive fissure. It couldn't even break where it hit, and it caused a fissure about 4 inches long. At which point it found a weak spot, and this soldier's leg bone literally exploded at this point. And it would have been very, very high, just next to his groin, where his leg had a compound fracture and broke into multiple pieces, and his bone was completely severed. This was a wound that during the Civil War would have almost certainly proven, this wound today would almost certainly have proven fatal. You could have certainly nicked, depending how the bullet went in, could have nicked or severed the femoral artery. But this is so traumatic. The only way to fix this is to do what's called a disarticulation amputation. Effectively, a hip replacement without the replacement, right? You would have to take the whole thing out. There were maybe 2 or 3 surgeons in the United States who could do that operation during the 1860s, and they were certainly not going to do that in a field hospital on a battlefield. And so this soldier made it to this field hospital alive, right? If this soldier had died where he had fallen, he would not be buried at the site of what was clearly a field hospital with all these amputated limbs. So this poor soldier lived long enough to go to a field hospital he would have been in unbelievable pain. It would have been realized by the surgeon that all they could do was to make this soldier comfortable. They could not have done anything to save the soldier's life. So here, the Smithsonian has been able to do a micro CT scan. This is like a super duper high resolution CAT scan. And so they've been able to make 3D models of the bones, and they can show us, they can put the bones back together, how they would break. They've been able to take the bullet in and out and play with all kinds of things that help them with the forensics of understanding the damage that was done to this soldier. They were also able to determine, and this is crazy, they were able to determine that the way this bone broke, the way this triangular fissure was, and what you can't see in this picture, there was actually a third piece. It would have gone right here, a little chip that came off. They were able to determine that this soldier, at the exact instant this bullet entered his body, he was bearing the entirety of his weight, quite a bit of weight, on his leg. So this soldier was moving, quite possibly actually running at the time he was shot in the rear end. So it is entirely possible. Again, we're starting to get into the what if scenarios, but what the science could suggest is this soldier was running away, was maybe retreating when they were shot. Something caused that bullet to go in sideways. If it hit a rock or something, 50 feet away, it could have done that, but it might have slowed down even more. But something, I personally have a theory of what happened here. Again, it's a theory. I think something on that soldier's body was obstructed by that bullet, which caused it to spin. And so here we have one of my favorite pictures, albeit just after the Civil War, but because it's a Manassas picture, I wanted to show you the dedication in June of 1865. These soldiers are fresh off of the Grand Review in Washington, D.C., and they've come out to Manassas to dedicate one of the 2 earliest monuments to the Civil War that were put in by the federal government at Civil War battlefields. This particular picture is the image up on Henry Hill of the Bull Run monument that went in. And it's a great picture for zooming in and looking at the backsides of Civil War soldiers and looking at all the stuff they carry. And if you look here down above the soldiers, kind of their right buttocks area is where at varying heights, the cartridge box would be carried. And so I think a possible suggestion is that this soldier was actually shot through, or perhaps the bullet clipped his cartridge box, and that's what caused it to spin, start to make a rotation, go in sideways, and cause the damage that it caused. Hard to ever prove that, but a theory. This is the actual bullet. You can see the nose of the bullet has actually been almost sheared off by something, whether it was by hitting something or probably from the soldier's bone itself. And you can see even the striations, the vertical marks. This is the rifling of the Confederate rifle that caused this rifling as it spun and left. The next image is something that we never expected. This is the piece of bullet that was actually inside the femur. And if you look very carefully, you can see a crosshatch pattern, all these little dimples, all these weaves and things. This bullet actually took a piece of the soldier's kersey trousers with it into the wound, smashed it up against the bone, and the soft lead forever left a fabric impression from his uniform on the actual bullet. That is the sort of thing that is virtually never seen. We have examples of this more so from the Revolutionary War with round balls, where they think bullets may have actually hit someone, hit a person's uniform, and left a fabric impression. This is one of the only examples I've ever seen from the Civil War, and it is indisputable what it is from because it came out of a Union soldier's leg. Burial 2. Burial 2 was a little bit older. He was probably between 30 and 34 years old. And that's significant when it comes to trying to figure out who people are, because as much as I don't like to admit it anymore, 30 to 34 during the Civil War was getting to be a little bit on the older side. And so this narrows down the range of possibilities of who the soldier could be. Not significantly, but it does. He was also same day basic isotope analysis. He was from the northeastern United States, New England, New York area. He's a little shorter. He was 5'5", a little less muscular, and he had a pipe facet. A pipe facet's a really cool thing that you see much more so in older burials from, say, the colonial times. This is from somebody who smoked a pipe, usually a clay pipe, and they would hold it. Anybody who might be a pipe smoker knows you oftentimes hold that pipe in the exact same spot in your mouth all the time. Well, years and years of smoking a pipe, especially a hard clay pipe, will actually leave a dent, a ridge in your teeth, and you can actually see where this soldier has held his pipe. So just an interesting human interest piece to who this soldier was. This soldier had more clothing on. He was wearing the remnants of a 4-button sack coat or Union blouse on him. And we're going to talk about that and why that gives us some more clues. Well, I'll just launch into it now. The bottom line is a Union sack coat was a mass-produced garment during the Civil War. But as many of you know who've read about the First Battle of Manassas, there were not a lot of standardized uniforms during the First Battle of the Civil War. Confederates were wearing blue, Union from New York was wearing gray, all kinds of different uniforms. And so sack coats had just started to be produced for the Union Army, and there were only just a handful of regiments who were wearing them during the First Battle. But by the time of the Second Battle, 13 months later, this would have been one of the most common garments worn by Union soldiers. So again, very strong evidence that this is Second Battle of Manassas. They were also wearing a Union issue shirt, we think, because they had a paperback tin button right here at their neck. That would have been part of a Dommett flannel issue shirt. And they had some sort of a clasp or closure near their neck, which again could indicate some sort of a blanket was maybe clipped around them as they were laid in the ground. This soldier had 3.31 caliber buckshot found in the ground near their body. None of them were in the bone. That's very rare, but they were near the body. One near kind of the thick of their calf muscle, one of them near their shoulder, and one of them in the region of their groin. They also had, and we didn't know this until we removed into the lab analysis, there was evidence that a 65 caliber round ball had passed through and obliterated their right shoulder, also where that buckshot was found. And so this is significant because while we talked about the rifle, the Enfield rifle, that bullet, that's from a rifled musket, very accurate, that was sighted up to 1,100 yards on that rifle. It probably wouldn't hit a person at that range, but a very, very accurate weapon. The other technology used during the first half of the Civil War was a smoothbore musket. This was basically Revolutionary War technology in terms of the projectile that was being fired, except during the Civil War and some earlier time periods, they added added some stuff, and they called it a buck and ball round. And it was a single 65 caliber round ball and 3 31 caliber buckshot, basically like a shotgun round. And so it increased the likelihood of hitting something because it was a smoothbore musket. It only had a front sight, no rear sight, and it was generally sensed to be accurate at a human-sized target at 65 yards or less. And so to increase your chances of at least causing some damage or a wound, they put this buckshot in. So this individual was shot by 3 buckshot and 1 round ball. And so that tells us one of 2 things. That tells us that this soldier was either shot by 1 pull of the trigger at very close range. I mean, not point blank, but if this soldier had been 65 or 100 yards away, those buckshot would have dispersed more than they did. They would have flung off 2, 3, 4 feet in different directions. So this soldier was either shot, within 40 or 50 yards probably, or he was shot by multiple people at once, perhaps during a volley that went off, and he was struck by 2 buckshot from one person and 1 from another person, 1 round ball. Either way, he was struck 4 times. The buckshot wouldn't necessarily have been fatal wounds, although the one in his groin certainly could have caused some significant internal bleeding that could have been fatal. But the shoulder wound was a very, very serious way. His right shoulder was completely destroyed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Portions of the body also were disturbed by plowing, but a little less so than the first burial. And research points to a limited number of possible candidates to identify who he is. I'm going to get to that piece in a second. I want to talk a little bit about this sack coat. Here's the 4 actual buttons here in the picture that were recovered from the body, and then 2 of the 3 buckshot in the corner of that picture. And then you have a picture of yours truly being a model on the ground, trying to replicate what we found in terms of the placement of the buttons. These buttons were in a very specific pattern. And we know from the spacing of how the quartermaster said these jackets are supposed to be made, that some of these buttons were in a kind of an odd pattern. And the only way we could replicate that was by kind of taking the jacket off and kind of wrapping it around the shoulder. And so a theory is that they almost had tried to maybe start to remove the jacket, realized they couldn't because it would just have caused excruciating pain, and then maybe use it to try to, if you try this, what's shown in that picture right now, it actually kind of tightens up your shoulder, right? If you're taking off some clothes and it's really tight, it actually helps to hold the shoulder in a little bit, so you're not swinging around a bunch. So perhaps when they were carrying him to the field hospital, they intentionally kind of wrapped it down around his shoulder to kind of hold his shoulder in place and not just dangling there. It's a theory, but it's one way we're able to recreate the way the buttons were. Oh, so before I go on to this, I want to talk about the limited set of who this could be. So we ultimately have not been able to determine definitively who these 2 soldiers were. In consultation with the U.S. Army, we did not take DNA tests. DNA tests require you to have a comparative test against, right? It's not like you just take DNA and it says, oh, this was Private Joe Smith. You have to have something to compare it to. And so the thinking was that it would be very difficult to do that. The Army also requested that that we did not take DNA samples because they ultimately, I'm jumping ahead, but they took possession of the 2 complete sets for burial at Arlington National Cemetery, and ultimately they made the decision not to sample for DNA. That said, we've had some great research that came out after we went public with this story, before the burials happened in Arlington, but we went ahead and went public with this. We didn't go public right away because we wanted to do as much research as possible to see if we could figure out who they were. We then went public before the burials, and not surprisingly, people really care about the Civil War and know a lot about their ancestors. And we started to hear from people who said, hey, I think you might have, my great uncle, or I'm going to do some research. Well, we had a researcher volunteer, and he looked at the casualty records from the Second Battle. And he looked, basically, long story short, because I'm running short on time, he ran through and pulled records that basically narrowed down the number of Union soldiers whose bodies were never recovered, who were from states from kind of New York on north, and who fell in the 30 to 34 age range. And he narrowed it down to about a half dozen soldiers or less. We were then able to go to the National Archives where we could look at their enlistment records and find out, among other things, how tall they were. And that eliminated others. And so we may have been able to identify, I shouldn't say identify, narrow down the likelihood of who this soldier is to one of possibly two soldiers, one soldier from the 12th New York and one soldier from the 17th New York, both regiments that were heavily engaged in the charge against the Deep Cut. It was the Pickett's charge of the Union side for the Second Battle of Manassas. This was across well over a half mile of exposed open ground against effectively an almost entrenched Confederate army hiding in the, not hiding, but positioned in the unfinished railroad. Dozens upon dozens of artillery pieces sighted in and raining down. It was a horrific charge. Some of the same Confederates who were fighting against the attacking Union attackers. In fact, some soldiers from Georgia were some of the same soldiers who a year later charged as part of Pickett's charge. And in their writings after the war, they said that what they witnessed the Union charge against them at the charge of the Deep Cut was worse than what they had to go through at Pickett's charge. That's how terrible this was. These soldiers were being shot at as they approached and as they retreated. And so both these soldiers from the 12th and 17th New York were lost in that charge against the Deep Cut. So I want to move on a little bit in the interest of time. I know I've only got about a few minutes left before I take some questions. I'm going to talk quickly about the amputated limbs, because that is where some of the other incredible science has been. This is just an example up on screen of what we were able to tell from these amputated limbs. This is one soldier's, I think this is a right tibia, or a right femur, excuse me. So this soldier was amputated very, very, very high. You can see the bottom of the picture, that's the knee joint. Okay, so everything from the knee, we have it, but it's not in this picture. This is just the femur. You can see that this soldier, if you move all the way over here to the right, you see very clearly the entrance wound. This went in from the side. Again, this went in from the outside of his, I believe, right leg, passed through, and here's the exit. You can see lots of bone is missing because chunks of bone and flesh went flying out when he was shot. You can see all the pieces of bone that were left, and you can see how we were able to piece it back together and see again the entrance and the exit wound. With amputations during the Civil War today, you want to take as little as possible, and you want to be as away from the central core of the body as you can. And so you had a much higher chance of survival if just your hand or just your foot was amputated. The closer you got to the trunk, the lower your likelihood of survival. Still pretty high, but lower likelihood. This is very high. This tells us that what this surgeon saw, they would not have amputated. This is again, getting close to the groin area. They would not have done this unless they had to. This tells me, and you can see some cracking, here and up here, whatever they saw, they knew that to do a successful amputation, they needed whole intact bone. You couldn't do a cut close to, oops, I didn't mean to go forward there, this close to the bone, to all this carnage. You had to have a solid leg left. And whatever they saw was so bad, they felt that they had to amputate very, very high. So we'll go ahead and we'll zoom in. This is that entrance, I believe the entrance wound. And you can see here, it's very, very zoomed in, but with these red circles, little specks. This is an X-ray, and what you're seeing are the remnant flecks of lead that were left from the bullet. Those flecks of lead are still imprinted on the bone. So we knew these were all bullet wounds, which was interesting. We could find the circular impressions. None of these were shell fragments, all bullet wounds. This is that same leg. This tells us a little bit about the skill of the surgeon involved. First of all, some of these legs, to contrast with that first one that I showed you that was pieced together and very crumbly, you can look at the resolution here. You can see, sorry, looking for my cursor again. You can see these striations. You can actually count the individual saw marks, and you can estimate how long it took for the surgeon to physically cut through this bone. And we think in most cases, the actual leg probably came off in less than 2 minutes. The bone cutting piece would have been probably about 30 or 45 seconds. Very, very fine tooth saw. And then at the end, you have this little bit right here. This is what is called the terminal snap. Very descriptive, terrible term. It's exactly what you're thinking it is. Think of it if you're out cutting wood at the wood pile and you're cutting, and you get almost all the way through, and then snap, the last little piece, it isn't a clean cut. Well, by Civil War standards, this is a very small terminal snap. And that means that this was a skilled surgeon who probably had somebody helping stabilize this limb so it wouldn't just drop off. Again, gruesome, but it's important to share the experiences of both these soldiers and these surgeons. So in terms of what this tells us, additional research that we've done, we may have started to narrow down that this could have been the field hospital of Surgeon Captain Benjamin Howard. Benjamin Howard was a surgeon at a rendezvous point after the Second Battlefield. These were not soldiers who were treated the day they fell, if they're wherever we think they came from. This was a field hospital that was established after the battle and was treating soldiers for up to a week after the battle. Soldiers who were suffering out in the horrible heat, and then a huge rainstorm that came up a day later. Folks who are familiar with the Battle of Chantilly, where General Phil Kearny was killed. Drenching rainstorms soaked this area. These soldiers were out in the elements for days in some cases before they were brought to this field hospital. Captain Howard seems to have ended up being a bit of a leg specialist. We have his records, and we know that on one particular day, I believe it was the course of one day, he amputated 13 Union soldier legs. And we have the specific information about whose legs, right, left, lower tibia, upper feet, where it was, the regiment the soldier was in. And we have started to try to match legs that we have found to legs in these records. We believe there may still be legs left in the ground. Perhaps based off of the ground penetrating radar we've done, a relatively small number. Based off of this evidence, and we're still doing this research, but again, evidence suggests that this could be this particular surgeon's field hospital. And if that is the case, we may be able to match legs with individuals and then start to reach out to families and say, hey, sorry, but the National Park Service here, we might have your great-great-great-grandpa's leg from the Civil War. We'd like to talk to you about what we might do with that or what you might want us to do with it. So incredible opportunities for telling more parts of the story. We've already had people reach out to us who have their great-great-great-grandfather's wooden prosthetic leg from the Civil War whose legs were amputated during the battle. Imagine if we could do a display where you've got an amputated limb or a recreation of it and the prosthetic that soldier lived with for the rest of their life. So lots of neat potential moving forward. So kind of in conclusion, the decision was made that the two complete sets of remains should be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Manassas Battlefield, unlike Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, where there is a national cemetery, we do not have a national cemetery at Manassas. We do have a Confederate cemetery where almost 600 Confederate soldiers are interred. But the bulk of the Union soldier remains that were recovered from Manassas and some from the surrounding area, Rappahannock, all the way down to Fredericksburg, were all collected in 1865 and 66. And interred at the Tomb of the Civil War Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery on the grounds of Arlington House, Robert E. Lee's and the Custis family's former mansion. And so we thought it was fitting, although the cemetery wouldn't allow us to put them in that grave, for them to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And so we transferred the remains to the Army in the summer of 2018. But as a final piece, our staff at the battlefield are very, very attached to this discovery. In fact, in some sense, they feel a little responsible for what was done. Imagine being the guy operating the backhoe. We don't like to disturb graves. And so our staff, excuse me, was able to identify a rather old historic oak tree, not necessarily a witness tree, but a tree that had to come down anyhow. And so we took that wood and we milled it. And our historic preservation specialists put together historic kind of toe pincher coffins that these two soldiers were laid to rest in when they were buried at Arlington Cemetery. So we took them, we wrapped them in reproduction U.S. Army blankets, set them in historic period coffins from trees on the battlefield, and then they were placed. Here's an example of the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington. They were placed in the military made us put them in modern caskets, but they're inside those, they're nesting in these historic recreated coffins. And here is their actual grave, where both of them lie at Arlington National Cemetery in the lower right-hand corner. And so we continue to do research. We continue to work with the Army and with other folks. We have to actually work through quite a process to determine what happens to the archaeological site and what happens to the amputated limbs that we currently still have in our possession. As we work through that process, we're not taking any further action. And then once we've done that, we may go back to the site. We may rebury the amputated limbs. We may use them for teaching tools. Military forensics folks and doctors still use examples from the Civil War today to learn about trauma and battlefield amputations. And so we are still working through that process, but ultimately we will most assuredly be doing a significant exhibit in the park about this significant discovery that was made. So with that, I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and then however much time you guys have left, I'm more than happy to answer some questions.
Just to remind everybody, if you need to ask a question, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Brandon, I have a quick question about like standard operating procedures subsequent to this. This was pretty much the first time this has happened on a battlefield. And did you, or are you, like, obviously you're getting all this down or writing all this down, but is there any like plan to implement this as part of a procedure in case this happens again?
So a quick clarification, this actually, although not frequent, this does happen on Civil War battlefields. There have been multiple examples at Antietam battlefield where they've discovered remains. Gettysburg has found them. I know of a few, maybe not in the battlefield, but even down in the Fredericksburg area where partial remains were recovered. But what is not as typical is the utility line piece of this. Although there's the Centerville 6, I think, were found in what is now McDonald's parking lot when they were doing excavations there. So it does happen. Technically, we followed all the best procedures in this case. And I don't want to come across as defensive or anything like this. I'm just trying to explain. There is no way in the case of archaeology to know that you have found everything unless you dig everything. And so I glossed over this. They did a metal detector survey of much of this area. They also dug test pits every 20 feet or so along this entire trench before it went in, and it just missed it. And so short of an archaeologist excavating an entire trench by hand, which would be extremely time consuming, it would be very difficult to avoid this in the future. That said, one thing that we did take a good look at was our notification procedures. There are things that we could have perhaps done better in terms of coordinating with the State Historic Preservation Office once we had made this discovery, let them be aware that we were going out to go back to look for these. So in terms of the initial work, not so much, but there were some improvements that we've done additional trainings and talked to people about, look, like if you find what you think could be bones of a person, even if you don't think they are, let's look at these right away. Again, that wouldn't have avoided this, but we've developed some more best practices moving forward.
Thank you.
Brandon,
Yes.
why couldn't they have taken DNA from the two remains and put them into a database like Ancestry.com or something like that?
Because the Army, when we transferred them, effectively claimed, and this is the point of much discussion, the short version is the Army asked us not to. I don't want to sit here tonight and speak for why the Army made that decision, but our leadership decided that we would respect the wishes of the Army to do so. Again, there is incredible increases in forensic science that has been developed, just as mentioned about the isotope analysis, but still it does require, as you mentioned, like with Ancestry or whatever, something to compare it up against. The Army has also made it clear to us that they think that efforts should be focused on trying to connect folks from more modern wars, really from World War II on forward, to next of kin who may still be alive. And so again, I don't want to cross the bounds and speak for the Army, but ultimately they made it clear to us that they did not wish DNA samples to be taken, and the Park Service respected that.
I was wondering, I know you said that the actual site of the discovery has to stay undisclosed, but I was wondering if there is anything that you can speak to at this time at how far the burials might be from the field hospital location. Just kind of curious, like, were they burying very close to a possible site, or is that not even something that can be guessed at with the modern topography?
Yeah, that's a good question. Based off of our working knowledge, they were pretty close. This was not like a quarter mile away from the field hospital. This was in effectively what I would call probably the immediate vicinity of the area that was the field hospital.
Anyone else have a question?
I have another question.
All righty.
Okay. While you were doing the work to uncover the remains, did you have any issues did people, see that tent set up and come look and ask questions? And did you have any issues with having to keep people out of there? Did you have to post guards?
Sure. So we did. So we closed the site. Obviously, we didn't advertise this, and where this site is it's not readily visible from some of the main areas in the park, which is another reason why we really need to safeguard the location for now, because it's not easily visible. So this was not an area where we were concerned about just like kind of the lay public coming through. We did have our park law enforcement there monitoring who was coming into the site. And this was before I was superintendent, so I can't speak to this eloquently, but I'm pretty sure for the period of time that we actually had the pit actually open, they did have law enforcement there 24 hours. And then we still do have other measures in place, which I cannot disclose, to help with monitoring the location of the site.
Well, Brandon, thank you. I don't hear anybody else speaking up here,
Okay.
but I really obviously you've got a lot of enthusiasm for this, as you rightly deserve to have some. I mean, this is really, really something. And what was really amazing to me is the way you interacted with the Smithsonian and were able to do that. And I'm kind of glad you were close enough to them and had that kind of relationship with them where they were able to pitch in and really get to the bottom of that. Isotope thing is fascinating, but I guess that's what happens, and kind of learn new things.
Yep. You got it. No, we're very fortunate. And again, the Park Service, we've gotten to share the story a good bit, but we are currently working with the Smithsonian. Ultimately, we would like to produce some sort of perhaps a small book or booklet or something that we would sell maybe in the bookstore at the park, kind of talking about the history. The Park Service would kind of write the history side and the Smithsonian would write the science side. We think that would be a really popular thing.
Sure.
John, I have a question actually that just prompted one on my part. Great presentation. And you talked about the fact that you all have that good close relationship with the Smithsonian. Is it safe to assume that the same sorts of associations exist between the Smithsonian and places like Gettysburg, Chickamauga, Shiloh? It's not just a Manassas thing. It's a Park Service thing. Is that correct, Brandon?
Yeah, I would generally be supportive of that. Those of us closest to DC obviously have the closest and easiest access, if you will. But that being said, there are remains, those examples I gave a moment ago, multiple Antietam examples, and the Gettysburg example, the same exact folks at the Smithsonian worked on those. And I have no doubt if there were significant forensic discoveries elsewhere in the service, that we'd be able to get the Smithsonian to help us out.
All right, all I hear is silence. Anybody else? Brandon, thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation. And I'm so glad you're able to take some time out from what's obviously a busy schedule to fill us in on this. And for everyone's information, we have a YouTube channel. And we were able to take this video and put it up on YouTube. So if you have any friends or neighbors or somebody who's missed the original presentation, you'll be able to see it on YouTube. So thank you again, Brandon, and good luck on the rest of your projects, as well other things going on as well as this one. But thanks so much for sharing your night here Monday night with us.
Absolutely, more than happy to. As you can tell, it's a great story. It's kind of the quintessential Park Service story to tell, and so we appreciate being able to share it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much.
You take care now.
Okay, thanks. You too.